as we did yesterday afternoon session at 2 o'clock, we're going to move into the compassion wing of the practice. Remember, that's important to give balance to our shamatha practice. Otherwise, if we just do shamatha practice, there is a danger that that practice will lead us to become more self-absorbed and disconnected from the world. So we need to stay connected in a healthy way. And we do that by cultivating these qualities within the compassion wing of practice. Yesterday we looked at the loving kindness practice, again in Sanskrit Maitri, in Pali Metta. And we saw there that the loving kindness practice, or loving kindness, was the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Today we're going to look at the compassion practice. And just as with loving kindness, compassion is not an emotion, it's an aspiration or it's a wish. So compassion is the aspirational wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So of course, if we want to cultivate this aspirational wish to be free of suffering and its causes for ourselves and others, then of course it would be helpful to know what do we mean by suffering and what are the causes of suffering and can or how do we eliminate those causes. So let's have a look at those questions now. So first is, what do we mean by suffering? And here, the word suffering is a translation of the Sanskrit word dukkha. This word is very difficult to translate. In fact, I don't think there's any word in English that has the same sort of precise meaning. Normally, when we use the word suffering, we're normally thinking about unpleasant, painful physical or mental experiences. So of course, we would like to be free of unpleasant experiences. But here in compassion, in the Buddha's context, that's only part of compassion. And so when we talk about dukkha, we can talk about three types or three levels. The first one is the dukkha of suffering, and this is referring to unpleasant, painful physical and mental experiences. But also, as part of the human condition, we can talk about the dukkha of change. Which is referring to our pleasant experiences. And here, the Buddha was using the word change to really get us to appreciate that our pleasant experiences change, or in other words, they're temporary, transient experiences, that they're never going to last and they're never going to fulfill us, and thereby we can stop having craving and attachment for them, which just causes a lot of unnecessary suffering. But underlying both our pleasant and unpleasant experiences, there's something deeper going on. And that's what's called all-pervasive dukkha. And what that means is that the human condition is such that there's always a potential for some sort of suffering to arise in our life. That we can't go anywhere and be anywhere to be free of that potential of suffering. That potential is all-pervasive. It's pervading our life. Every moment of our life, that potential for suffering is there. So, when we talk about cultivating compassion for ourselves and others, not only are we talking about to be free of unpleasant experiences, but at the deepest level, we're really talking about being free of this. And this all-pervasive dukkha is leading to us to appreciate the causes of suffering. Why are we stuck in this state of dukkha? And the reason we are stuck in this state is because of our mental afflictions. And often here, these mental afflictions, we see a presentation of what's called the 3 poisons, which we looked at briefly yesterday. That at the deepest level, the fundamental root cause of suffering is ignorance. And ignorance here is our mistaken view of reality. It's grasping onto an independent me and an independent objective world. And that's what leads to attachment to pleasant things, aversion to unpleasant things, and all the other mental afflictions and suffering. So therefore, when we're cultivating compassion, if we can appreciate this and understand this, and particularly to understand that this is something we can eliminate, then compassion is not simply some words of may I and others be free of suffering and its causes. Then it has some meaning, because we appreciate what we're talking about. We understand what the causes are, and we can understand that we can get rid of the causes of suffering. Any questions about this?
Could you please give an example for the causes of suffering?
The example?
How
Yeah.
it's related?
Ignorance.
Yeah.
It's grasping onto independent me, independent world. That we believe, and that's how we relate to it. There's a me here and an independent objective world there. And we're going to see a little bit this evening how that is the root of the other mental affliction. So that's a little bit the topic for this evening. So that is the root cause, and that leads to attachment to pleasant things and aversion to unpleasant things. So very briefly, to give a brief answer, and then we maybe talk about it more this evening. We grasp onto an independent me, independent world. So let's say we're having a look at these flowers. We're experiencing these flowers, and we're having a pleasant experience. then that pleasant experience, together with the belief that there's a me here and the flowers are independent of me, will naturally lead me to assume there must be some attractive quality there that's causing my pleasant feeling. So we'll see these flowers as attractive from their own side. Now, I like pleasant feelings. I want pleasant feelings. I want pleasant experiences. Those flowers seem to be causing my pleasant experience. I want those flowers. Attachment. Or if I'm having an unpleasant feeling, unpleasant experience when I see these flowers, together with this mistaken belief that those flowers exist independent of me, I'm naturally going to assume there must be some unattractive quality there that's causing my unpleasant experience. I don't like unpleasant experiences. I don't want them. Those flowers seem to be causing my unpleasant experience. Get them out of here. Aversion. So this is how ignorance leads to attachment, aversion, and then all other mental afflictions like jealousy, anxiety, and so forth come out of one of those or a combination of them. And that's what's driving our behavior, leading to this state. So that's the short answer.
I don't understand all pervasive.
So all pervasive means there's always a potential for suffering to arise, and the reason the potential is there is because of this. As long as we have this mistaken view of reality in our mind, in every single moment there's a potential for suffering. Because in every single moment, if I have a pleasant or unpleasant experience, then attachment, aversion, and then suffering arises because of this ignorance. That's what all pervasive means. Any other questions about this?
But whether you're saying that our default mode is bound to suffer.
Right.
So
hang on.
there's a catch here.
No.
You have to invest a lot of work in order to
To what?
to grow out or to eliminate the ignorance.
Sure.
So
But that's the long-term strategy. The short-term is we do things like we've been doing this morning in the shamatha. Is that when these things arise in our mind, instead of getting caught up and following them, we just look at them. And then they don't really cause us much problem. So already, immediately, things are better. But yes, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that these things will always be there as long as this is here. But at least in the short term, through shamatha practice and other practices, we can not allow them to produce as much suffering as they normally do by not getting caught up in them. So we have short-term strategy and long-term strategy.
But don't sometimes our tendency to aversion can help us? Like if you see something that is poisonous, it might smell bad, and then it's our instinct.
This is one of the topics I'm going to talk about after the meditation, so I'll answer it then. Okay. So with the compassion practice, like loving kindness, we cultivate this in stages. So like yesterday, with compassion, we start with friends first, most easy. We expand that out to people we don't know very well, expand out to difficult people, towards all living beings. But again, we need to start with ourselves if we're not kind and compassionate to ourselves. That's the starting point. So, like yesterday, we'll do a meditation now, cultivating compassion, starting with ourselves and then slowly expanding out to others. So let's do that meditation now. setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Setting the mind in a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Through focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. Compassion is the aspiration or wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. And we can begin by cultivating compassion for ourselves and then expanding that out to others. No matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind, no matter how much anger and craving and jealousy and so forth are in our mind, they are merely covering the surface of our mind. And beneath these mental afflictions is the inner purity of our mind. So imagine this inner purity of the mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, How wonderful it would be if I were free of suffering and its causes. May I be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And then imagine your mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling your body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing your mental afflictions and suffering at your heart, dissolving them into the inner purity of your mind. And then imagine you're now completely free of mental afflictions and suffering. And rest in that purity of your mind. And just as you wish to be free of suffering, so does everyone else. So next bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, who's currently experiencing some sort of physical or mental problem or suffering. And imagine them very clearly in front of you. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of that problem, free of that suffering. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And then imagine their problem or suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And then with each in-breath, imagine drawing that black smoke out of their body and bringing it into the sphere of light at your heart, completely dissolving it there. So with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. And then imagine they're now completely free of that problem or suffering. And take delight in this. And then allow your field of compassion to expand out to the person seated next to you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they were free of suffering and its causes. May you be free of all mental afflictions and suffering. And again, imagine their mental afflictions and suffering in the form of black smoke filling their body. And with each in-breath, breathe in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering and mental afflictions at your heart. Then imagine they're completely free of mental afflictions and suffering now. And rejoice in this. And And then allow your field of compassion to expand out further. And allow your mind to move around. And whoever comes to mind, whether it's a friend, a stranger, or even a difficult person, attend to them. May you be free of all suffering and its causes. And breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. Allow your mind to continue to move around. Whoever comes to mind, whether it's an individual or even a group of people, attend to them. Breathing in with compassion, dissolving and extinguishing their suffering at your heart. No matter how much darkness is drawn in, it is all extinguished without a trace. to do now is have a look at anger, to clearly define what do we mean by anger and how to deal with it. Sometimes in these three poisons, ignorance, attachment, aversion, sometimes they're listed as ignorance, attachment, and anger. And the reason being is that anger is a very strong type of aversion and a very destructive one. And anger here is defined, it's sort of the flip side of attachment. Yesterday when we looked at how attachment is defined in Buddhism, is that attachment was a mental factor that sees its object as attractive, it exaggerates the object's attractiveness and then wishes to possess and hold the object. Why? Because attachment sees that object or believes that object is the source of our happiness. Anger is sort of the flip side of that. Anger here is defined as a mental factor that sees its object as unattractive, it exaggerates the object's unattractiveness, and then wishes to harm the object. Why? Because it believes that object is the source of our suffering. So what we see in both attachment and anger in the definition, and this goes across all mental afflictions, is this factor of distortion or exaggeration. And I think this is something also commonly understood in psychology. And I've got a quote here from a book from His Holiness Dalai Lama. He says, "Recently, a psychotherapist told me that when we generate anger, 90% of the ugliness of the object of our anger is due to our own exaggeration. This is very much in conformity with the Buddhist idea of how mental afflictions arise." Now, of course, anger being a mental affliction is something we need to eliminate 100%. And generally we appreciate that anger is very destructive and we want to eliminate that. But sometimes there's some doubts regarding this. And one doubt sometimes that comes up is, I actually need anger in certain situations. When I'm dealing with difficult situations, I need anger as the driving force to deal with difficult situations. Yes, it's true, anger is very forceful. But as we saw in the definition, and we know through our own experience, that anger distorts and exaggerates. Which means that, particularly if we have very strong anger, we often overreact in our response, and rather than resolving a difficult situation, we make it worse. Because we don't see the situation clearly, because anger is distorting and exaggerating. And then our reaction is not appropriate. So Buddhism would say that to deal with a difficult situation, we don't need anger. In fact, you'll often hear in Buddhism they say, rather practice patience. And then also, often there's a lot of confusion here. Because often when we hear this, people think, according to Buddhism, then I just sit there and do nothing. This is not patience. Patience is not a behavior. Patience is a mental attitude. Patience in Buddhism is defined as an undisturbed mind in the face of a difficult situation. So therefore, Buddhism is recommending that when we're faced with a difficult situation, remain calm. Because if we can remain calm, we can better and more clearly and more accurately evaluate what's really going on. Then we have a better chance of responding in a better way. And what is the forceful thing we can use in a difficult situation is compassion. Often people feel that actually anger is a sign of strength and compassion is a sign of weakness. but actually it's the exact opposite. Anger is a sign of weakness because it means we can't deal with a situation without trying to dominate someone. And compassion is a sign of strength because we're trying to deal with that situation effectively and resolve it in a good way. And remember, compassion is not an emotion. Compassion is not sort of sitting there smiling and saying nice things to people. This is not compassion. Compassion, again, is the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So if that other person is engaging in harmful behavior, then compassion means to try to help that person to overcome that negative behavior. And so if they're engaging in some physical harm, then with compassion we can restrain that person. We use physical force if necessary to restrain that person. Of course, if we allow anger to get into there, then we often use excessive force and then the whole situation gets out of control. What I'd like to do to look at anger now is that why is it that actually we get angry with people who behave badly? And why is it so difficult to have forgiveness and compassion for people who behave badly? And I think there's a very simple explanation. So if we see someone engaging in some harmful behavior, the correct perspective is to acknowledge there's a person doing a bad or harmful action. But often when we see such a situation, we don't have this perspective. And often the perspective that we adopt is there is a bad person, there's a nasty person, horrible, evil person. So what we've done here is we have fused the person and the behavior together and made them one thing. So in psychology this is called cognitive fusion. And if we do cognitive fusion, we're in trouble. Because in any given situation, we've got two choices: accept or reject.